You've probably watched hundreds of videos about other architecture students giving advice about the things that they wish they knew before starting architecture. And, sometimes it can be really frustrating because they seem to talk about the same points. It can get fairly vague, and you kind of just want to hear something a little bit more applicable or a little bit more authentic.
So in this episode, we're actually going to be talking about the darker side of the things we learned in architecture school. Like the design isn't important. School is not enough.
What?
And guess what? F your design process.
Oh, snap.
It's crazy. So when you listen to this episode, you'll see how we turn from hesitant first years to confident fifth years and how you can pick up some of the tips from our own experiences. Plus, if you stick around, we got a bonus tip for you at the end of the episode.
So pull up your Rhino file, get Arc Daily open on another tab, and let's get into it. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Crit Room Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan, with my co-host,
Albert. Just Albert.
And we're officially back.
Yes, sir.
Oh man, it has been a minute since our last episode, and we've got quite a lot to catch up on. So if you're curious about where we've been in the past couple years, we'll talk about it in just a minute. But otherwise, if you're just here for the content, no worries. Skip forward a couple minutes and we'll see you over there. But you may have noticed a couple of changes.
Yeah, we have a bunch of stuff that we need to talk about. But one, we are starting completely fresh. New look, new feel, new everything. So why we did this is because after graduating, we saw it as a great opportunity to restart, redefine who we are, what we are, and why we're doing things the way that we are. And so we want to graphically represent that as true designers that we are.
Of course. So we did a whole new graphics overhaul. You might have noticed already. The logo looks a little bit different, and just the Instagram's looking a lot different. We actually have more than one post on there now. So check it out if you haven't already. But also, you're seeing us for the first time, sort of. We're on YouTube now. So
before we didn't even have any videos or anything in our previous episodes.
I know, you're just cramped in our little Crit Room as the origins, the big old lore of the Crit Room happens, you know?
But then again, before we were trapped in the basement, so there was nothing really there to look at, if you know what I mean.
You didn't want to see it anyways. But also, you might have noticed, new theme song. We kind of wanted to switch up the vibes a little bit, signify like it's a new season. New season? Yeah. We're officially kicking off a second new season of the podcast.
To align our episodes around the same time as your semesters were happening in studios, so you had some content to listen to while you're working in studio or just roaming around. And so our previous 6 episodes, it was more of a pilot season where we want to test the waters. And we tested the waters. It was kind of cold, but also warm at the same time. It's kind of like someone peed in a pool or something. But as you know,
we're here now. Yeah.
For real. But as you know, studio takes a lot of time. And so it got super busy for everyone in the semester and just got busier and busier.
Yeah. So architecture is hard. Things got in the way a little bit. All of us were completely abroad for internships, study abroad and everything. So we were in totally different continents, totally different time zone. It was basically impossible to record. So when we got back from all that too, then things got even busier because now we got thesis to deal with as fifth years. We have seminars, also just job applications. So it was busier than it ever has before.
But in the end, we got through our challenges. We graduated with our 5 years master's degree. Essentially, I won't say it, but we conquered studio. And now we're taking this mad seriously. And so we're trying to help you conquer your own studio experience. So if you stick around, maybe you can.
Facts. Let's start with our first point. What we're going to say is that presentation is more important than design.
What does that even mean? That's a crazy take.
Yeah. What does that even mean?
Well, I think when I think about presentation is more important than the design itself. So the design is supposed to be there, right? But then how are you going to sell the design or like your own proposal if you don't even know how to do that? Like they will never buy
Right.
your design if you don't even know how to present your design. And so that's
Yeah,
like
because like
that's
we had a professor back in the days where they were basically saying like your design could be amazing, but if you don't know how to sell it, then you might as well not even have a design in the first place.
Professor Hot Dog was kind of he was he was kind of crazy about it, but we learned so much from it. But I think one of the major things that I learned from it was that humans are emotional people, and so I think that's why emotions sell.
Yeah. Because okay, so like with the emotions, right? Like not to make it sound overly dramatic, because you may not be able to make people like actually cry from an architecture presentation,
Hmm.
but you can still get them like emotionally invested.
Hmm.
So like when they're emotionally invested, then they become financially invested, which is kind of the whole perspective of what Professor Hotdog was talking about.
Sell me this, but
People are being like, "Who the fuck is Professor Hotdog?"
yeah, who's Professor Hot Dogs? Well, we have a bunch of professors that we have, and so what we're doing this season is giving them aliases. And so let's see if you guys can figure out who the professors are as you go on to the season this year.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Otherwise, okay, who Professor Hot Dog is? Well, okay, so Albert and I, we both had this professor. I think it was second year, yeah,
our second year.
yeah. And like his whole thing, besides you know, always asking people what a hot dog is made from. Every single studio, he would start that way. He'd be like, "You know what's in a hot dog?" And all of us
It
like,
was
"What
it
does
was
this have to
such
do
a
with
weird
architecture?"
anecdote.
It like I don't know. There's a lot of things this guy would say. Half of it just it went over our heads, but he did have some really good points throughout the
Yeah.
semester too. Like on the whole topic of the presentation is better than or more important than design. His whole thing was saying, "Sell me this. Like
Hmm.
you got to sell me this design." Because the whole point of him is thinking about it more from like you're at an architecture school now, you graduated, you're in the workforce, maybe even started your own firm, and the whole entire thing, because again, architecture, it's a business at the end of the day. You got to know how to sell your services to clients out in the
Mm.
world, and if you can't sell it, no one's going to buy it. No one buys it,
Mhm.
you only got money, now you're homeless on the street. So you gotta you got to know how to sell things.
No,
And
for real.
like it didn't really like hit in that moment because they're like, whatever. What do you mean you have to just sell a design?
No, like
But
you
it
remember
makes a lot
his
of sense.
do you remember his story about Maya Lin with the Vietnam War Memorial? That was like when everything clicked for me.
Yeah, background context. So essentially in that studio with Professor Hot Dog, we would always have assignments where we had to draw out certain things in our notebooks and we'd post them up on the boards in the crit rooms and we would just put stickers on them. And the whole
Hmm.
point that he was trying to get at with that is we would always try to explain why we liked certain drawings more than other ones we'd see around the class, to just get people to think like, oh, maybe I should design a little bit more of this or like draw a little bit more like this to evoke emotions. Because going back to the whole Maya Lin thing, shoot, I kind of forget. I think it was a competition for the Vietnamese War Memorial,
Hmm.
right? And the entire point of the competition, it was like 1,400 architects, all
Hmm.
were competing for the same project, basically. And then out of all 1,400, like 1,400, that's a lot,
Yeah,
right?
and they're all like professionals too.
Yeah. This single, like 21-year-old student
Yeah, from what
won
was it?
against all of them by doing this specific thing. Yeah.
No, yeah, from
And they
Yale,
were
right?
like, ooh, yeah, from Yale or something. So it was like stacked against, I'm sure that helped a little bit, but
Yeah.
the whole point is like Professor Hot Dog is like this one 20-year-old or 21-year-old student won against all 1,400 people by doing this. We're like,
Yeah.
doing what? Like, what did they do?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he's
Okay.
like,
So
he flashes the design on the screen,
right.
and it's just like this black gash across this green like char or a green charcoal drawing type of thing.
Yeah.
And we're
You
like,
have to look this up
what?
in the internet. Like
This
you
one?
go to Google and search up Myelin
Myelin.
Vietnam
Yeah.
War Memorial drawings, and you'll understand what we're talking about. It's literally
Yeah.
just a black triangle, and it's like, what is this?
Yeah.
And
Like you
then,
look at it, you have no idea what it is. It literally
mhm,
looks like it's an abstract drawing in a museum. And then
mhm,
you're like, this one? Like how? Like against 1,400 people? Like I'm sure someone had something better than this.
mhm,
But then that's when he hooked us in. He's like, so we want to know how she won it. And we're like, Well, duh, yeah.
It was just
Good.
basically like so. With the myelin proposal, it was really okay. The material choice was what a big part with her story, and the orientation of the design itself. Going like I think it was pointing back to the Lincoln Memorial, but also to the George Washington Memorial, going back to
Mhm.
the the past and like the history of the American history. And so she really wanted to hone into that. And so a thing with the war is that you only really see the names onto these like stones that they etch it on, right? What made her design was so powerful was because she chose it. It's not being white, but black, because what she wanted was when you look at the names on the wall, you would see the reflection
Of
onto
yourself in
of
it.
yourself, really like saying that you wouldn't be here without these people.
Mhm. And all of that, it was this narrative right on the side of the drawing. When you walked into the whole convention, all 1,400 proposals, it was kind of like a science fair, like you have a board, you would pin up your stuff to it, and everyone had to do some type of narrative, I'm guessing.
Hmm.
But then that one drawing, again, look it up on Google, that one drawing with that narrative, that's what won her the entire thing
Hmm.
against hundreds of other ones. Like, see if you can find the other proposals, and then you'll be like mind blown at how like that wins. But again, Professor Hot Dog, his whole
Yeah.
point of that is like your design doesn't matter at the end of the day, what it looks like per se, and how you
Hmm.
like present or how you graphically represent it. It's the presentation, that narrative in it. That's how you win. That's how you quote unquote sell that
Hmm.
design.
And so I guess a question I would have after that is like, what do you do to get to that narrative? What do we need to do in like as people, as designers, what do we need to do so we can get to the narrative, really focus in on that like that story building that she did so that she won. And so
Right, right.
I think that I do personally, and within the 5 years that I've been in school, the main point was that cut off your design early so that you can produce and focus on that story. And it is.
Like in production week and stuff. Like
Mhm,
if you normally go all the way until like the last, 24 hours or something,
mhm,
like intentionally cut it off like a week early. That might
mhm,
freak you out, but do this because this is a difference. This is how you go from like okay projects to like borderline competition ranking kind of projects.
mhm. Just like you see those students right in school where like they design until the last moment, and then when and then when they get there, they're like so sleep deprived that it's like the story just doesn't hit as well
Yeah, you
as
can't
it should.
present it well. You're stumbling over your words because your brain is a fucking like mesh of goo and everything.
Mhm,
It doesn't ever work too well. So if you
mhm,
start wrapping up your design as early as you can,
mhm.
then you have more time to put towards the thing that actually makes your project sound better. Again, it's not necessarily about how you present the project graphically. It's about how you present it in a narrative.
Yeah, and
So if you don't
something
get that
that
final render, it's okay. It's
yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah. I don't know, like the way that you present the emotional journey that people go through back, maybe because of your research, has then to like translate back into how the building itself becomes the emotional journey in a sense.
Because like another good point, I guess we could maybe end it on this too before moving on to the next point. But like overall, if you really want to just think about it like in a basic sense, if you're clicking through your presentation slides, does your presentation and your narrative does it feel like a movie?
Mhm.
Because ultimately, your presentation is not supposed to be a building tour. You're not a real estate agent. You're not walking people over. Here's the kitchen. Here's a living room. Upstairs, there's two bedrooms. No one cares. Nobody cares. No one wants to sit through that. That would be the worst movie of all time.
Yeah,
They want to like take them on an experience, take them on a
yeah,
journey. Like
yeah.
that's what your presentation is meant to be like.
Yeah.
So
It'd
think
be
about that
so
next time.
okay. If you think about it too, as like for horror, let's like say a horror movie. If you just say what it is, what it is, you wouldn't
Hmm.
feel scared at all. It'd be like, this is where you get jump scared because there's a there's a clown that jumps from the right side. But then with what actually happens in the movie is they build up the tension, the
Hmm.
music, and then boom, jump scare. Like they don't
And then
say
it hits
what's
you.
going to happen. They
Yeah.
make you feel what happens. And
So
so, yeah.
overall, presentation. It is more important to your design, but make a good design because otherwise your presentation won't be good either.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Next
The
point.
second point, what's the second point, Ryan?
School. It's just not enough.
It really
And what
isn't.
do we mean by that? Yeah. What do we mean by that? In my opinion, and a couple other people think the same things, but in my opinion, architecture school is meant for one specific thing, and it's meant to train you how to think like a designer. But that's only half of what it means to be an architect, right? You also need to have that like practical sense that you can get from like internships and everything. Because without both of them, then you are just a paper architect essentially. You have no idea how the reality works. You're just designing things on paper, coming up with all these theories, coming up with all this other stuff. But without the practicalness to all that stuff, then again, you don't have a design at the end, or you don't have a project. It's just drawings on paper.
Hmm. And
So you kind of
so,
need both that creativity from design school and
mhm.
then that firm savviness that you can get from internships or like your actual job.
Yeah, I think that's why it's so important to do an internship at some point too, because now you're getting both like the understanding of from the school, which is the creativity, the artistry, and then when you get into the firm itself, then you start to say like understand what the inner workings, the gears are, that what makes the project become a project. So you really need that firm savviness in a way.
Yeah, because another thing too is just thinking about it from a studio perspective. You spend hardly any time on your projects realistically. Like you have to go from schematics all the way to a quote unquote finished design in like 6 weeks sometimes, or even a
Jeez.
semester if you get further along studio or whatever
Yeah.
for a whole semester.
Hmm.
But you never really go in depth with any of those like phasings. Like you never really study schematics into design development, into construction documents and all this other stuff. And like
Hmm.
all that later stuff, like you need to learn it. That's
Hmm.
kind of why the AREs and all this other stuff test you on it because that's what you need to be an architect.
Hmm.
And without doing internships or just like an actual job, you don't learn that in studio because that's not their job. They're not trying to teach you how to put together construction documents. They're here to
Hmm.
tell you how to design or like teach you how to design or think differently about design.
Yeah. And I think while I was working in the Seattle firm, something, yeah, I think you also said this too, Ryan, is that your decisions make money, and so you have to be
Hmm.
super efficient in how like you design and how you use your time. And so I had this PM that was just like, "Oh, you spent all that time to do just this thing," but like when when I saw her work, like she's like, okay, let me pull up the Rhino model, and then I saw how fast she worked. I was like, oh my
Yeah.
god, like she doesn't, yeah, like she wants to get everything done so that she doesn't feel like a waste of money inside like the whole firm itself.
Yeah. And you can even take that mindset back with you to studio. Like for me, I did an internship in my third year. So when it came back to studio to, like finish out the rest of the schooling and everything,
Hmm.
I now had that like slightly new perspective on how studio works and everything. And I started to realize like, wow, like all these decisions that I'm making in studio before I kind of thought I was in a bubble in a way. Like when you're in studio, you're kind of just designing in a vacuum sort of.
Hmm.
And then when you go into the practice, you're like, oh wow, like this, like my pencil strokes on this trace paper, that's what someone is paying for. So then it's like, okay, maybe we should like actually take this a little bit more seriously
It
when we're in studio.
becomes it's actually so much pressure, you know, once you understand like
Yeah.
they're like, oh my god, it's also like they don't want you to take overtime because of that same reason. Time
Because
is
they have to
money to
charge
them.
clients for that overtime. Oh, if
Hmm.
they're a good firm.
Hmm.
But yeah,
And with
that's a
different
whole different topic.
phases, different phases, they only release a certain amount of money for that phase of the project too.
Like you got to stick to a
So
budget.
yeah, and so if like you kind of have to open up from one phase to the next phase, so that like you can have more money and so that you can pay
Hmm.
the people as well. So that's just something that I saw and what I learned from my PM.
Yeah. So, long story short, you need both perspectives. Another
Hmm.
point we can have on this is the idea of like skip classes, but also don't like skip classes.
No, that reminds me of the time when like I was supposed to say this, but like I intentionally saw an opportunity. Let's just say that. I
There
saw
you
an
go. Yeah,
opportunity to learn something, and I took that chance and went to experience the opportunity, and then experience the opportunity that I learned from the lectures. And so instead of just being just sitting there in class listening to the lecture, I actually experienced the lecture, if you know what I
yeah. Because okay, for some context, this is during the virus situation for monetization purposes.
mean. Yeah.
So when we were all doing this seminar, it was supposed to be more of like a second modern history type of situation where they tour actual cities in America and they show
Mm-hmm.
them to us. So they hired this company. Like they did a good job, to be fair,
Mm-hmm.
but you're just sitting there watching something that you might as well just watch on YouTube, like someone walking around a city.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, well, this is kind of dumb. Like, why? Like, we're sitting here watching things that half of us already know about and just like generic information for 30 minutes. So
Mm-hmm.
then Albert's like, F watching Chicago. I want to go to Chicago.
No, so I think I took off. What was it? A Thursday, Friday, Saturday, came back Sunday night, and went to class on Monday. So I took the 4 day weekend or something and just experienced the lecture.
Yeah.
Um,
And what do you
but
think,
yeah,
like, realistically, what did you think you actually pulled from going there in person or just like being able to step outside a studio?
right. Well, you know the Monadnock building with like how uh the bricks themselves be like the
Mhm.
Poche Professor Mies 2.0 was saying, like the structure was just like it gets thicker from the bottom, or it gets thick to
It starts
thin
out super
from,
thick at the bottom.
yeah, and then becomes thin at the top. And so you don't necessarily, you see the drawing, but you don't feel the drawing. And so when
Mhm.
we
Mhm.
visited there, I was like, oh my, I didn't realize how this building was actually like structured. And being there and seeing it in person, touching, almost tasting the building itself, the
We're just
building
licking the side of the building.
the building visually looked like it would taste like chocolate, but I didn't taste it, but it just looked like it. But no, like you have to be there to experience what
Mhm.
they taught you in class, and so
Yeah,
that's like
sometimes like you
one.
just gotta see it in the real world.
Hmm.
I think that ultimately
And
that's a good way to
yeah, and
summarize
then there
that.
was like, while I was over there, I didn't just visit buildings. I also went to visit different firms. So went
Mm.
to visit the really famous firm Studio Gang. I don't know if we
Mhm.
visited Studio Gang. We went to go visit Arab, which then designed like the Sydney Opera House and all these really crazy,
Oh,
crazy
wow. I didn't know
architecture
that.
feats. Um, Perkins and
I didn't know
Will.
they were in Chicago.
So we visited all those things, and so it wasn't just a lecture learning experience, but it was also like I got to learn what it is to be like in that firm, and so what the different things that they were working on.
Just bomb the kitchen.
Yeah.
With the ambiance, yeah. No, I think another point with this, and we can move on to the next, but this applies to a lot of things. But there's a saying where if you know how to teach it, then you know what it is, or like you understand it then.
Yeah.
And especially at our school, we try to do a really good job at this by trying to mentor a lot of younger students. Like we would go out of our way from like our fourth and fifth year studios. We would go around and try and connect with like first year students and just, try and catch them up on some things if they didn't quite understand it, or maybe
Mm-hmm.
get them a new perspective from like now that we're, at the end, quote unquote,
Mm-hmm.
what we've kind of seen as we've gone through that whole
Yeah.
process. And just like,
The,
yeah.
there was this like one student that, he was in second year, I was in fifth year, but he just came out of a NOMOS competition, and he was like, I'm so frustrated. I was like, oh, okay, let's talk about it. And so
Mhm.
like he felt safe enough to talk about it with me, and also like thought that something like there's some things that as a second year, because you've done the research, what is right, but then how it's executed isn't right. And so we were basically saying that,
Mhm.
okay, your research, like, it's true, what you're doing is right, But then I was like, okay, but what if you look at it from this perspective? And so really talking and teaching younger students really gives you a new perspective yourself, but also gives them a new perspective, giving like you
Yeah,
both
because
are
now they're
taking
learning
something
beyond their
new.
own studio. They're kind of getting
Mhm.
like low key, kind of like a free trial of fifth year knowledge,
Yeah,
or older year knowledge, and like
yeah,
get some bits and pieces that they get to try out.
yeah. And another thing too is like we went to go visit, or I went to go visit one of the studios that were right next door, and I was like, "How's your final project going?" And so she showed me her board, and I was like, she was a second year, and I looked at it, I was like, oh, this is something that I would do as a second year. I'm like, okay, let me give you some fifth year tips. Like, this is what you should be
Mm.
doing to make it look nicer, make it sell better. And so after that, I went back like after another week or so, and I was like, oh, this completely changed. This
It
looks,
makes a
this,
difference.
it looks
Like you
so.
see it kind of click.
Mm-hmm,
I was gonna say that kind of transitions well into the next point of being like, theory can only take you so far. Theory is great in general for architecture. It helps you really like push the boundaries of what certain things mean. You can kind of get a little crazy with and be like, what is a staircase really? And then you get something like the Venturi house where a stair just goes directly into a random wall for no reason.
I see
But
that's like I like the idea, but I don't know how it's like the execution is
yeah,
just
the
interesting.
execution is gone. But like, I guess more the lens of what I was thinking about this too is, thinking about like first year concepts, the things that we start out learning right away. It's like, here's datums, here's the senses of enclosure, here's the degrees of enclosure, and it's trying to figure out the differences between like changes in elevation and how that it changes experiences. Like at a first year level, a lot of it is just like it's really hard to comprehend, especially if you've never been exposed to any one design classes of any type before, two just don't even know how architecture really works. So a lot of it's just like, you're kind of just nodding your head and just drawing anyways. But then once you make it from, first year, go through the whole entire process of architecture education, hit fifth year, and then you're re-exposed to those same concepts of like, what's a floor mean? You're like, bruh,
It's
we're fifth years.
actually
What do like you mean a floor means?
it's
But
actually
then
kind of
they
crazy.
show you different projects like the Sana Rolex Learning Center. If you haven't seen it, you should Google it.
Look it up
But
right now.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Do it. Do it.
You got Arc
But the
Daily on the
whole
side
point is it looks
already.
like it's yeah, yeah, yeah. It looks like a Swiss cheese building. That's when you know you found it. And the whole point of it, right, is the floors in there are hardly flat. Like there's hardly any spots in it where it's a flat surface. Which
Mhm,
like, you think about that from a first year perspective, like that doesn't make any sense. Like why would somebody make a floor that's not flat or
mhm,
whatever?
mhm,
But that's kind of the point. That's what Sana was going for. Like they were trying to turn this mono experience of just a flat floor, and just
mhm,
by like slightly pushing it up, all of a sudden there's a artificial hill, and all of a
mhm,
sudden that creates so many different types of experiences where
mhm,
now that you're up on this same surface, yet it's the same surface just elevated, now you get an entire view of that lower level that you were just at,
mhm. But
and you
when
didn't
you're at
walk
the
up these
lower
stairs.
level, you can't see what's happening beyond the hill. And so
So
like
then it makes you want to go
yeah, it
or
makes you
explore.
feel like you're inside a room itself, even though it's all continuous space, right?
Hmm.
That's
Yeah.
like that's what's so amazing about it.
Like we won't go super in depth about it because you have to do your own research. But
Yeah.
it's just like it's a really cool way to see that they took theory of like what can you do with a floor and manipulate it in a way to change space. And then they
Mhm.
did it with a lot of
Mhm.
money, but they did it.
It's like an experiment which worked in some
Yes.
capacity.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh, another thing that kind of goes back to this is the have you heard of the Uber, like how Uber started and like why it started?
Not really.
So Uber, as you know, was just like it's kind of like a taxi
Yeah.
thing where you just get in a car, you pay them as they drive you from one place to another. Well, the main reason why Uber became so revolutionary, so innovative, was because of this concept which combined the ordinary taxi experience, the idea of like taking one place to another,
Mhm.
but giving it the extra push with the concept of frictionless user experience. Because back then, when you're trying to do the taxi thing, you have to like get in the street, yell for taxi. Sometimes they don't even stop for you because they already have people there, and once you get off, you have to pay them. You do all these different things. There's so many things that are so many frictions within the whole experience that he was just like, this is not gonna work. And so he tried to look at um how can we make a taxi experience as frictionless as possible. And so it like
Like when you
became
put it
this
in that way, yeah.
yeah, it becomes like this super revolutionary idea that's taking an ordinary piece of thing and then adding that extra sauce that gives it the bump up, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Because then I guess, yeah, because I mean, that's going more into the point of like revolutionary things in architecture usually are just a standard thing plus random concepts. Or in the case of like big or something, they take two typologies that don't even seem like they would ever exist together, they mash
Mhm.
them together, and that becomes like one of the coolest things you've ever seen. Well,
Mm.
controversial, but like no one in their right mind would be like, oh, let's turn a waste power plant and make it in a way where people actually want to go walk all the way up to the top and be able to ski down it and have a rock wall and all these other things.
Yeah.
And they're like, what? Like that sounds like who would be dumb enough to do something like that? Like that doesn't make any sense. And then you see it happen, and you're like, wow, this is some next level stuff.
Don't tell your professors because they will hate forever. Like don't want to talk about it unless you are talking about like diagrams, big diagrams.
Yeah, yeah. Hmm. But no, it's just, like trying to take some ideas from other things, combine
Mhm.
them with architectural ideas, and see what happens with it. Like
Yeah.
there's that theory aspect, but theory
Mhm.
can only take you so far. So you have to figure out how to actually turn it into something.
Yeah. You have to take it further. That's where
Because
innovation
yeah,
happens.
yeah. Because I
That's
guess another
that's
part is you can only stare at a concept for so long
Mhm.
until you can start making a building out of it. Like another aspect to the whole like theory can only take you so far. You can only stare at your concepts diagram
Yeah,
for
your
so long
computer,
until you
the
turn it into
paper.
something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I remember this a lot with Professor Hits Different Hits class, where I would like my concept for the museum was exchange. And I'm like, how like this is the concept I want to work with. This is how it fits into my narrative. That part works. But how does architecture exchange
Mhm.
in a less metaphorical or like theoretical sense? Like how do you
Yeah.
make that happen? So
Yeah.
it was just a lot of those cases where I remember sitting with Albert in studio, just going back and forth with ideas like, how do you like, what do you do? Like, is the architecture the thing that exchanges, or like ultimately it's the people that have to exchange? So do
Mhm.
you just have like little landing zones next to the stairs where people can sit down
Yeah.
and talk to each other? Like, I just like it seems a little too shallow of an idea. Like,
Mhm.
there has to be something else.
Yeah.
So eventually, after like a lot of iterations, just talking it out, it was taking that diagram from just like two boxes exchanging other boxes with each other. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. What if staircase in the middle, you have two different gallery sets on different sides of the building. People can
Mhm.
choose their adventure in a way. They can either go left or they can go right.
Mhm.
They go through their experiences with the three galleries. They meet
Mhm.
back in the middle. Then you hear people talking about what they learned from gallery A. People from gallery A hear what people learned from gallery B. They're like, ooh,
Mhm.
I kind of want to see what that's about. Maybe they chat about it or like, hey, what's over in that gallery? It's like, oh, it's really cool. You should check it out. Boom,
Mhm.
exchange. They go
Yeah.
to the other side. The other people go to the other side. I'm like,
Mhm.
genius. Did it. All right, great.
No, no, on that same point, I think that something that I got stuck on was just the emotional part of the architecture. Like, how do I translate this emotional experience into something architecturally, like, experiential, right? And so I remember sitting there, and then everyone was like down in their dumps, and so Professor Hits Different pulled everyone to, like, in the circle, and then we did this design charrette that was like, okay, write down your three sentences of your concept, and then we put it in like someone's hat or something, and then we drew from the hat. And after opening that, like the piece of paper, they would then have to draw something that would what it would look like experientially as an architecture form. And so that's when it hit to me. That's when, like, I think
Mhm.
Sully got my thing, and he was just like, dude, your architectural experience is very similar to the artistic, like the 2D art that you made. Like it's exactly the same thing. And so like, it was so eye
Yeah, just
opening
like
for me.
connected dots so you didn't really know were there in the first place. It sometimes
Mhm.
takes other people to help you connect those pins. So,
Yeah, it's you need to talk to people. That's for
yes.
sure.
Okay, next point. You're not that guy.
What do you mean? I'm that guy.
Okay, what we mean by that, basically, don't drink the ego juice.
Oh,
Like,
dude.
there's certain moments where it's kind of like nasty personality in a way. Like for some reason, it seems that architecture school can breed a lot of like egotistical type of designers. Like
Mhm,
everybody wants to be a architect type of stuff. But
mhm.
then the architects are whatever the statistics are, like 1 in a million, whatever.
Yeah,
Like the likelihood of you being this architect is pretty low.
yeah.
And the thing is, like, a lot of people treat their own projects like they're untouchable. Like this is the next Mona Lisa of architecture type of stuff. And like,
Mhm.
okay, like chill out. It's not perfect. Like let's like we need to talk through some things because if you can't acknowledge that your building has flaws or like you can't acknowledge that your studio project has a lot of room for improvement, it's not going to set you up very well, especially when you
Yeah,
get into later stages.
yeah.
So caution against it, basically.
I remember the thesis. As you go through the architecture school, you kind of learn that like ego isn't really there to push your project further. It feels more of like sometimes
Like a barrier sometimes,
yeah, it's
like
like
a box that it keeps you in.
yeah, it hinders you. And so with ego, it kind of makes you like I'm the better person. And so you end up not talking to people because you think your ideas are so good and stuff like that. And
Or
so
even the other way where you want to keep it secret because like, oh, this is the
right.
best idea, so I'm not going to tell anybody, so I win this
Yeah.
competition. And
It's
like to a
so
certain degree, yeah, but also
no, because like people will become better when you talk things out, and you can learn so much from other people when you talk things out with them. And so I don't know. It's like on my fifth year, in my thesis, I learned so many things, and then all of a sudden, during the jury, my Professor Labcoat was like, "You need to drink the ego juice." I was like, "Nah, I'm good with that." And I also talked to I had talked to Doctor or Professor Seinfeld about it too, and he was just like he was like, "Yeah, don't do that." and then and then yeah, it was just everyone was in agreement that I should never drink the ego juice because
because
it's not good.
another part of it too, I guess you could look at it from this lens, is yes, you want to take your project seriously. Like you don't want to just not take your education seriously, but you also have to realize that your studio project at the end of the day, like it's never being built. It's not like you don't have to worry about all these crazy little things that are like either going to make or break your building. Like
And
being more
when
humble with your designs. Like it's not that serious, especially if your building's not being built. If your like biggest idea that you want to do gets shot down by a professor or like in mid crit, the craziest
mhm,
idea that you had for this building, and someone points out it doesn't work. They're like, I get where you're coming from, but that idea just like your concept doesn't work in your building as you're doing it right now. Instead of getting all huffed and puffed up about it, stay humble.
mhm. Stay humble,
Be
king,
humble, king,
queen,
queen,
queen.
them.
um, I think there's
Like
also
be
the
open
point
to
of
feedback.
yeah, there's a point about the arrogance versus confidence type of thing too when you
Mm,
present the
yeah, yeah,
project.
yeah.
Some people take it to, like the ego so far that it looks like arrogance. It feels like
Mhm.
arrogance. Like you're there as a person to give the voice to the project. That's who you are. You are what gives the project confidence. So like confidence is what you are striving for because some people take it where I'm the person that made this building, so I am the one that's in the center. When in actuality, the project itself is the center, and you're just there to give it a voice.
Mhm. Oh, another part. This actually, like, seriously, don't be this guy. Don't be this person. Like, don't be that annoying person in studio. We've all dealt with that situation. You're in studio, it's like 7 o'clock at night, and all of a sudden you hear something coming from outside of your headphones, and you look, and it's someone else singing. It's not Taylor Swift singing her song. It's someone else singing Taylor Swift's song in studio. There's no reason for that. It's so like,
Dude,
and I'm
there's a
guilty of doing
reason.
this a lot too. I do like a lot of humming. Like I try to be like very quiet and like whisper, sing type of stuff.
Yeah.
But there are definitely people that I witness in studio who are full out fucking like belting the
So
vocal
put your
cords.
hands up and play my song.
It's Miley Cyrus.
You know?
Let Miley Cyrus sing her songs. You don't
Yeah,
have
for
to.
real.
It's okay.
For real, for real. No, but on that same note, I think that when you're taking calls, don't take the calls in front of the
Go
whole
out of
studio.
studio when you're doing that stuff. Like you can take like 5 minutes away from your projects just to answer a call. You like don't be that
Yeah,
person. Stop it.
yeah.
Stop it right
Now
now.
now I know what your issues are, and I don't wanna know
Yeah.
what your issues are. It's entertaining at some
It's
points.
kind of fun sometimes. It's like low-key like live Kardashian show or whatever, but
It's
it's
like,
just
I could
don't be
not
that
care.
person. Last point. F your design process. Hmm?
What do you mean by that?
Hmm?
What do you mean by that, Ryan?
I'll put it this way. There's not one design process. You got to be open-minded. You got to try out a lot of different things. Your design process, while it might work for you at this current point, do you really think like that's the best potential of your design process? Or do you think there's room for other people's influences? I would say always be open minded to hearing other people's design process because it might just make yours even better. Like from personal experience,
Mhm.
I never really felt like I had much of a design process, especially going into Professor Hit's different classes. But after like I wasn't closed off or anything, but I just like I was taught how to do things a certain way from other
Mhm.
professors in the past. Like make your building like very precise. Like make sure it's form follows function type of thing.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden out of nowhere, Professor Hits difference like, let's do art class. I'm like, this is architecture school, not art class. Like, what are we like? What? But then, like, again, following that process, like being open minded, like, okay, let's see what this art thing's about. Like, we're listening
Mhm.
to music. How bad can this be?
Yeah.
Right. So then, as we just said earlier in the episode, actually like being open minded, doing that process got us like the best kind of projects we've ever created in all of our
Mhm.
entire like academic career.
That's where everything, like, clicked for everyone, I think,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone
Yeah,
got
and it
really
all
good
just
projects.
happened when like you broke away from like your own type of process that you started with, and you like
Mhm.
grab bits and pieces from other ones. And we'll have a whole episode on this soon. But okay, so go back on that point actually. I would also say don't be afraid to break away from a professor's design process because sometimes there are professors that sort of shove their own ways of designing a project down your studio's throat and be like, do it this way. This is how we're doing the studio. And there
Mhm.
are certain, like, again, like, accept it, like, try and see where they're coming from. But also, don't be afraid to, like, go a little bit further and, like, grab some other pieces of things that you've learned from in the past and add it onto their process.
Mhm.
Again, another situation with mine was one of my recent professors. They had a completely different way of designing architecture than I was taught from all the other 4 years. And
Mhm.
part of me was just like, fundamentally, this just like feels wrong now. Like we're just doing things based off of architectural concepts. Like that's not how like buildings work. That's not how projects work. Like you can't just create a Frank Gehry looking building and just cram this stuff into it. That's like the
Yeah.
opposite of what we're taught. I still went along with it. I was still like doing it as we were talking about in studio, but I also simultaneously, it was kind of a lot of extra work to be honest, but I was doing the research to figure out like on our site, how can we go with what this professor's saying, go with this architectural thesis type of concept, but
Mhm.
then let me add on the parts that I really like the research, figuring out how people will actually use this project, figuring
Mhm.
out what if I'm making this curve? Can this curve serve a purpose? Thinking back to
Mhm.
like the Rolex Center from Sana, like how did they do this sculptural move that looks like an architecture thesis type of concept, but it's still functional? Like it's a library at the end of the day. You can still use the space.
Mhm.
So I broke away from my professor's process a little bit and just added on some extra elements, and I think it turned out a lot better. Like
Yeah.
you could tell a difference between the final presentation of that project, the people who simply just did it as a form and put function afterwards versus like putting more emphasis and research into why those things happened.
Yeah.
and what it does for the project.
Yeah. I think one point too is that I had this professor, we'll call him Professor Galaxy Brain, who like I didn't have the same design process as him. But the way that his brain worked made me realize that there are more ways than one to see a project in that way. I remember doing like these diagrams. I was just like, person goes from entry, then goes into the exhibition hall. But then like he was like, okay, this is good. This is good first steps, but architecturally, what does this look like? How can we push this idea even further? How can we turn this into an art rather than something that's so functional? Because in the end, that's what people people feel
Hmm.
emotions. Even though at the point he didn't say that, but I understand it now. The art itself
Hmm.
becomes like this emotional journey. And so how can we create that same feeling for other people? And so from
Yeah.
then on, my like Ryan can attest to this too, but my diagramming style is very unique, very me because of this
Hmm.
singular professor who I didn't have anything in I didn't have anything in common with. Like the way that he thought, we had nothing in common, but his process made me look at diagrams in a in a different way.
And it
And
looked really good too. It got you. I forget. Like I know for sure it was highlighted in our studio for Final Crits or something. But yeah, it's a very distinct way of thinking about diagrams because it's like experiential instead of programmatic approaches,
mhm,
really. And I haven't really
yeah,
seen a lot of them do that before.
yeah. And so, yeah, there's no one way to see a design. There's no one way to do a design. You have to become a
Yeah.
sponge and take everything from people, even though you at first it doesn't feel like it's yours. But in the end, I do think that you can make it yours. You just
And
have
you
to
can
see it
even
from your own
like,
way.
yeah, I was gonna say, even pushing it further, like if you take away like the process that or the ego from your design process and you open up to others, you can go from like, I mean, not saying that your projects are boring before, but you can go from like your typical projects and like that level of praise and everything to even getting them to like competition level projects in one
Hmm.
semester. Like that's
Hmm.
essentially what happened for me in Buzzer Hits Different class, where it went from,
Dude, we
thinking
had
the
no
way I was
buildings.
before. Yeah, I was gonna say
We
thinking the
had
way it
no
was
buildings.
beforehand, and being able to absorb parts of their process and figuring out the way that they saw architecture, and it got it almost to the point where it's like top 10
Hmm.
percentile of our studio, like the
Yeah, yeah,
top 3 or 4 projects or something.
yeah, yeah,
And like I
dude.
never thought that was possible. The way I used to think about like beginning that semester to the
Hmm.
end, completely different.
Hmm.
Whole different way of talking about architecture, whole different way of looking at architecture. It like worlds of differences. And then that
Hmm.
part just like it stuck with me and everything. And like you can truly elevate your skills a lot just by entertaining the fact that a professor wants to do something a little funky and be like, let's do
Yeah.
art. Like,
Yeah. See, I never did the art thing either until that class. And God, that project I did for that class, it's probably one of my favorite projects in my whole like school experience.
yeah. So that wraps up our 5 things. But wait, before you go, we have a bonus one for you. This one's actually really good. You want to hear this. I think the single most important thing that I've learned from architecture school, ironically, wasn't even architecture related at all. It is basically like taking business classes puts you in a whole different level of thinking,
Hmm.
of talking about projects, actually starting your career and getting internships and all that stuff. It's a whole different game. So, me personally, I took an
Hmm.
entrepreneurship minor, Sully did too, while we were going through architecture school. It kind of sucks because we couldn't really take a lot of the classes because of just how architecture scheduling and, the business college scheduling the classes. But the few classes I did take, very impactful. Like by taking these classes, I was exposed to like a bunch of like actual like business owners, like entrepreneurs that would come into the class and just talk about their stories, talk about how they went from an idea, kind of like architecture, like an idea,
Hmm.
all the way to an actual thing, like something you can tangibly hold, something you can interact with, things that people buy every single day. And part of that too is like hearing their stories of like actually building businesses, That was really helpful for figuring out later down the line, like say I wanted to open up a practice at some point. I kind of now have like a little bit of a sneak peek of how that process works. Like I could
Mm-hmm.
sort of figure out how to start my own firm when I got like my license or something.
Mm-hmm.
And the other part too is just like even with this podcast, like hearing the way that they would talk about their stuff has really helped like me and like the rest of our Kurt Room crew figure out how to run this thing
Yeah.
and actually like turn it into something serious.
No, Ryan's been the one that's been leading this whole thing because of this thing that he's talking about right now. And like he is like the leader, and we're just like, let's go Ryan, and I'm like,
No, you
we're
guys do
supposed
a
to
lot.
go.
You guys do a lot. But no, it's just like ultimately too, it's just I learned so much about mindset that also carried back to architecture of like, dedication and discipline in following a vision, like staying true to your concept and making sure you hit that at every single level. And then just understanding how money influences decisions. Again, Professor Hot Dog, sell me this. Money, making decisions based off of money, being smart while you're working on things and being efficient with your time. All these things impacts the real world and how it functions. People are paying for your building that you're designing for them. So
Mhm.
making sure that you're being smart with your design decisions so they don't all get value engineered out at the end. And, again, like selling that idea, just making sure people are emotionally invested. So they are financially invested in your company. They really believe in what you're doing, but replace company with studio project.
Mhm.
And yeah, actually just selling yourself as a student too, when you're in interviews and all that, being able to like walk people through your portfolio when you're sitting across from another firm owner across the table. And now it's like real time. You have to sell them your studio project and how you did these things. So that way they like, wow, this person knows a lot. Like they did this pretty well. I want to hire them.
Mhm.
So it really helps like when you conduct yourself in interviews too. And when you
Mhm.
present yourself as you know what you're talking about on a business sense, you can probably negotiate pretty well for higher pay or something too, because you know all these things. You can make them aware that you're aware of these things. And
Mhm.
it's probably the biggest thing I've ever taken away from architecture. And it's not even
Mhm.
architecture related. I think the biggest takeaway from all of that is truly I learned something at every single year in the process. Every single semester, I learned something different. And it just kept on like compounding. It almost seems
Mhm.
like an exponential graph of like how I viewed architecture and learned from other professors to like seriously go from like, a noob first year kind of mentality all the way to like, wow, this is like feel like I know a lot now.
Mhm. Mhm.
Feel like
Mhm.
more of an experienced designer, more adequate with knowing how things
Yeah.
work. But
Yeah.
it took those years, all of that combined experience, talking with other people, talking with other students from other universities, and figuring
Mhm.
out just like how truly great a lot of the things that we learned in our education specifically impacts a lot of what we do today without even knowing
Mhm.
it until you look all the way back.
I think the thing that I would say for my main takeaway is coming from school is not enough, but more specifically, skip classes, but don't skip classes. Is that like in the end, we are not a professor, or we're not profession where we are all in it by ourselves. You kind of have to talk to people, and so I do think that to become a great designer, you have to be able to take in information from people, but also teach and mentor other
Mm,
students and people under like in lower years than you. And so I would suggest everyone to go out there and talk to some second year, first year, third year, if you're a fifth year, and just give some wisdom or something that can help them with their journey.
give them a little sample, some cheese from Costco. Just like, what do you think of
Yeah.
this? Try this out.
Yeah, yeah. Also, yeah, what we did too was like we would have snacks in class, and then we'd be like, "Oh, this is too much," and so we would end up going to the studio next door, and be like, "Hey, we got some food. You guys want some?" And so it was just like we're all a family almost. It's
Mm,
like it sounds cheesy, but it really does feel like that, and you have to keep that same culture, be there for everyone, but also be there for yourself.
yeah. So thank you guys for listening to this episode of the Great Room Podcast.
And before you leave, real quick, check out our Instagram at Crit Room Podcast and we're super active there now. We have more than one image now. And so we want to encourage you guys to DM us your questions and topics you want us to talk about.
And also, if you enjoyed this episode, then you'll probably want to check out one that we did from last season. It's called How Do I Know If Architecture School is For Me? It has a lot of similar topics that you'll probably find interesting to you. So if you haven't watched it, check it out. But otherwise, see you guys in the next episode. And don't forget to save.